it water with the sheep in the box?
I wasn't going to make this. In fact, one of my New Year's resolutions is to try and get away from this kind of direct response video and make more nuanced videos with a bit more of a point to them, like my JXE and cultural Marxism videos, because I think that kind of makes for better content. But I did also leave a caveat in there that if I saw videos so bad, so cringy, or so infuriatingly, hilariously wrong that I felt that I had to, then I would make a video, so here we are. As you may have guessed if you saw the video I made the day the results were announced, this past election really hit me quite hard. It really, honestly, seemed like a turning point in British politics, and after Cameron and May's concealed malice, lies and hatred of the poor and vulnerable, we finally had Boris Johnson, a man who openly supported far-right policies and people, barely even bothered to conceal how little he cared about the vulnerable, proudly displayed his posh, borderline fascistic bigotry and prejudices at almost every point on the campaign trail, barely even campaigned, didn't bother to show up to debates and hid in a fridge to avoid journalists. It seemed that the consequences of a decade of Tory rule had finally come to bite them in the arse. Reports had come out definitively proving the genuine atrocities, actual murder of the poor, disabled and vulnerable, racist attacks on black Britons like the Windrush scandal had come to light, and the deliberate and malicious attacks on the NHS were demonstrated to have been causing severe hardship, and the blight of austerity was starting to become more openly acknowledged as food bank usage skyrocketed, whilst politicians claimed that that was somehow a good thing, and hundreds of thousands of people were proven to have been killed as a direct result of Tory policy. People like me were genuinely hopeful for the first time in almost a decade. This might be the one. Now the evidence was out there, the only possible way the Tories could have won was if I had miscalculated my fellow British people's capacity for empathy, and large sections of the voting public demonstrated themselves to be at worst hateful bigots who would happily vote against their own interests if it meant that marginalised people might get hurt more than they would, or at best believed the easily disprovable lies propagated by the right-wing media who were at the time terrified of a man who could, if he won, conceivably tax them a little bit extra. Or else I guess we're just more concerned with triggering the libs than stopping the crumbling of our NHS or the pseudo-genocide of some of the most vulnerable members of society. Predictably, the British public disappointed once again, and the Tories won a landslide victory, demonstrating that almost 2/3 of the UK voting public are just okay with the deaths of hundreds of thousands of vulnerable people and children being forced to rely on charity and food banks in order to not literally starve to death, apparently, which is depressing. There have been tons of theories as to how this happened, ranging from Labour's message didn't connect with voters aged over 50 in the north of England to Johnson kept going on about getting Brexit done and that's basically all anyone cares about nowadays. But probably the most infuriating of these takes for me has been the liberal elites talk down to traditional Labour voters and that's why they voted for a party that actively wants them to die, mostly spread by newly converted reactionaries because they want to be able to blame their political views on anyone but their own internalised hatred of minority groups and or triggering the libs, and of course centrists who don't want to take responsibility for their part in the far-right winning yet another victory. Here's where VeeduVidz comes in. Who's VeeduVidz? Well, he's a self-proclaimed comedian, a word I use in the loosest possible terms, because like most of the right's fabled comedic elite, he doesn't seem to really do much comedy, more just sort of malformed socio-political commentary with the occasional incredibly weak bit of satire thrown in there. He also makes great musical comedy too, just take a look at these complete masterpieces.
Yeah, it's VeeduVidz on the mic. Given that I work every day and every night, gonna break it down for all you people. Got logical proof that music is evil. Music messes minds and makes you tipsy. Look at Gaga, look at Britney, look at Whitney, and look at 50. There ain't no denying, bruv. You get me? Classical, jazz, reggae and pop, R&B, country, Bollywood and rock. They're all so addictive when the beat drops. You better not listen to them, full stop. Music magic turns man into a monster. It will leave your head scarred like Harry Potter.
I'm a sick act, I like a quick snack. Yeah. I'm a sick act, I like a quick snack. Yeah. I'm a sick act, I like a quick snack. Yeah. I'm a sick act, I like a quick snack. Yeah. I'm a sick act, I like a quick snack. I like a rib rack, I need a tic tac. My best smells like cheese, people move back. The struggle is real, my dean is intact. Keep calm, increase your patience. I'll lock Satan up in my basement.
Basically, it seems like VeeduVidz is a centre-right political figure who doesn't seem to really understand a lot of what he talks about. But before we move on to talking about the election, I want to provide some context. So first off, let's take a look at his genuinely terrible take on race in the UK.
Yeah. Check it.
There's a lot of fluff and bullshit in this video, so we'll be skipping a lot of it, but the basic fundamental point being here is that VeeduVidz is, in his own words, a brown guy with pale skin, which according to him means that he's not accepted into either brown or white social groups a lot of the time.
So technically speaking, I'm a brown guy, but I'm pale skin. So I'm not brown enough to be cast as Mowgli in the Jungle Book, but I'm not white enough to be cast as James Bond in James Bond. Idris Elba. So I don't know, I kind of don't have the white privilege and I don't have the brown privilege. I just thought I'd throw that out there to anyone.
Which is a real problem, I get it. Like, there is a lot of racism and also prejudice within racial groups as well, towards or against people being paler or darker. For example, white people tend to joke about gingers quite a lot, even though technically speaking they're just a subset of white people. Likewise, there's a lot of societal prejudice against very dark-skinned people, to the point where dark-skinned models have a much more difficult time finding work than lighter-skinned, though still black models, even when pictures like this exist. And I'm going to move on very quickly so I don't go all horny on main. So this isn't what I take issue with. What I do take issue with is the rest of his arguments, as we'll now see.
Speaking of race, I don't think we talk about race enough in this country. I mean, it's not like we go on and on about racism and colonialism and cultural appropriation and diversity and quotas.
So yeah, here we are. Apparently in the UK we constantly bang on about diversity quotas, colonialism and racism, even though statistically we actually don't, which is disappointing because in my opinion we really should talk about this stuff more than we do. And even if we did, it wouldn't be a huge issue because our Prime Minister is provably an open racist and possible white supremacist. Further, the fact that people like Johnson can get into power, hold the most powerful job in the country, one of the most powerful in the world, despite having repeatedly derided formerly colonised groups and suggesting that perhaps they should be brought back under colonial rule, well, maybe that might imply that we have somewhat of a racism problem and that there's a lot to take issue with when it comes to the British mentality of reminiscing for the empire and the atrocities committed under it.
And how white people have, have to pay for their past sins, even though the white people now weren't the white people that did the crimes, but nevertheless, they're white, so I guess that's, they have to take the responsibility for their actions, they have to inherit the guilt and the sin of their forefathers.
The point of reparations isn't punishment, it's fairness, and helping to rectify many of the problems we caused. The Europeans stole billions of dollars in resources, brutalized the people, left entire continents ravaged by the legacy of their actions, and crucially, are still benefiting from that legacy. The global dominance the West holds now is as a direct result of the sins of our ancestors, and likewise, so is the poverty and unrest many of these former colonies now suffer with. The reparations are to help address this balance and enable these third world countries to finally recover, without having to continue to struggle on extremely limited resources. To frame it as white people have to atone for their ancestors' sins is clear ignorance and or misdirection. No one is seriously suggesting this.
I really wish I had someone to talk about race too. I would talk to white people, but they're not allowed to have opinion on race because, by default, they're kind of racist, even though they don't realize it, because just the lack of melanin in their skin means that they're not as open-minded and woke to the different nuances in the melanistic people of the world.
Not all white people, but Western society teaches of the glory of European history, treats other cultures like they're lesser, and holds up people like Winston Churchill as heroes, despite the fact that they committed horrendous atrocities in the Third World. Canonically, Doctor Who is good friends with a guy who murdered millions of Indian peasants whilst calling them subhuman, and that should not be normalised to the point where he's a friendly character in a kids' TV programme, and also appears on our £5 notes for fuck's sake. If we learned about other cultures in our history classes, or maybe some of the horrendous things ours did in order to become so prominent, well, maybe we wouldn't still be stuck in this post-colonial mindset or worship a hereditary fucking monarch.
So, I would talk to brown and black people, but they're too oppressed. You see what I'm saying? Like, if I talk to them, they're so oppressed with slavery and colonialism.
Genuinely don't know what the point he's trying to make here. Potentially this might be some kind of commentary on how often white progressives will talk over people of colour or refuse to engage with ideas that conflict with their own from the groups they claim to be standing up for, which is a real problem, but he doesn't elaborate or confirm that that is what he means, so I'm not sure if I'm being too generous here.
Especially the ones in the West that are got the iPads and computers, but they're just too oppressed. right?
Again, people of colour in the West are not oppressed just because they have access to technology like iPhones or computers. Oppression doesn't equal poverty for starters, but even if it did, being less oppressed than people in the third world doesn't mean that there's no oppression going on. By that logic, there's always someone more oppressed than other people, so only one person on the planet, the most oppressed person in the world, is allowed to complain about their situation.
You know, it's like when people say, you know, America's really, really racist. Like Trump is a white supremacist and it's you know, Islamophobic and Muslim ban and this ban and that ban, and slavery, but at the same time they want to send Syrian refugees to America. So why would you want them to send Syrian refugees to a racist, Islamophobic, white supremacist country?
Because it's their legal obligation. Don't get me wrong, I do think that Trump is a racist, Islamophobic, white supremacist, but just because he's a bigot doesn't mean that the US gets to shirk its diplomatic and legal responsibilities. The refugees can't go home by definition, and they have the legal right to be there. Sure, it may be pretty bad and they may suffer some prejudice, but it's better than being in an active fucking war zone.
And maybe you guys can offer me some insight of how to overcome my oppression without becoming the oppressor. Because you see, when people overcome their oppression and actually think, you know what, maybe I'm not that oppressed, maybe I've actually got it pretty good here in the West, we all of a sudden become Uncle Toms and we become part of the oppression. We become part of the oppressors, rather. So, I don't know where to go, man.
Well, if you're invalidating the experiences of other people who weren't so lucky, put them down, use yourself as an example of how things should be, call them lazy and so on, well, yeah, let's use an analogy here. Rather than talk about race, let's talk about gender. Blair White is, in my opinion, a transphobic trans person who uses her privilege and position in order to bash other trans people and actively oppose trans activists fighting for their rights. She misgenders, harasses, invalidates, lies and grifts. She calls people who don't get surgery trenders, non-binary people mentally ill, equivocates trans people with child predators, and makes videos insinuating that trans people are infiltrating the media and forcing an agenda onto your kids. But she can't be transphobic, she's a trans woman. Likewise, if a person of colour started doing similar shit to or about people of colour, then yeah, I'd say that might make them an Uncle Tom-like figure. Though of course I don't really know if I should be using that word, I'm not entirely certain if it's a slur or not. Who wants to preserve their own privilege at the expense of the liberation and equality of other people of colour? Black people owned slaves in the 19th century. They saw their slaves as subhuman just as much as the white landowners did. Do you see where I'm going with this? Being part of a marginalised group doesn't mean that you're incapable of prejudice against that group. It just means that in a sense you're throwing the others under the bus and shooting yourself in the foot.
Colin Kaepernick. I don't know. I just thought I'd just throw that out there because you might thought I should say that. Colin Kaepernick. You know, black guy, afro. I don't know. Raised by two white parents. One wants to blame Donald Trump for Black Lives Matter or police oppression, brutality against black people in inner cities, even though that was happening for many years, but now Donald Trump is apparently the reason why.
That's not what the NFL kneeling thing, Black Lives Matter as a movement, or any of Kaepernick's other charitable and social work has been about. Police brutality has been around for decades and has been protested for decades. It will be protested until it stops. The problem he has specifically with Trump is that Trump has increased the power of the police, empowered ICE to go after immigrant families, and suggested that neo-Nazis and the people who protest or oppose them are equally bad. Likewise, it's usually the police who protect the neo-Nazis against the protesters. See, this is the kind of dismissive, ignorant bullshit that someone like Veedu, who has no fucking clue what he's talking about but really likes to pretend that he does, would say in order to make himself feel smart, when in reality it just makes him look like a complete fucking moron. And that's it for this video. Yeah, he's a delight, and I'm sure he's going to have some fair, honest, balanced opinions when it comes to the nuances and complexities inherent to the December 2019 UK election.
Yeah. Check it. Yo, how's it going, people? It's your boy VeeduVidz in the house. I hope everyone is doing well.
That sounds familiar.
What's up, geeks and gamers? It's Jeremy coming to you with another video.
I'm sure it's just a coincidence.
This is a direct message to my friends on the left, my liberal friends, my socialist friends, any hard left friends or followers I have on this channel. This video is for you guys. Right? Because I'm sure you've been licking your wounds, you've been drying your tears from the recent election. Boris Johnson has won in a landslide, Conrad Corbyn is gone, and we're going to get Brexit done. So that's the end of that. Now, if you want to understand why you guys keep losing, please watch this video.
Oh yes, please do explain. It'd be good to have a definitive answer that doesn't boil down to the British people are becoming more and more unempathetic and stops caring about other people. I would love to believe that that's true. Please, Veedu, go ahead. Tell us why.
He is a pig, and I'm so ashamed that he's the Prime Minister of my country. It's disgusting, and I wish him the worst. I wish him a horrible death. I don't know if you're allowed to put that online, but he's everything up for people my age, our future. I plan to work in the NHS. I plan to be a doctor. I plan to actually care about people. And he doesn't care. And to see working class people caring about Boris Johnson, they're shooting themselves in the face. It's disgusting. And yeah, I wish him the worst. Go yourself, Boris Johnson. Honestly, what a sorry.
Nice clip from Breitbart fucking news there, mate, showing one single protester who I agree with incidentally. The man is a bigot and his party has caused the deaths of obscene amounts of vulnerable people and pushed even more into abject poverty, so if that's the most vitriolic reaction you can find, that's pretty tame. Seriously, how many people do you have to kill? How many hate crimes does he have to inspire? How many kids does he have to push into malnourishment, poverty, and forced to rely on charity food banks to avoid starvation before it's okay to react angrily or protest him? Saying go fuck yourself is unacceptable, but decades of racism, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, classism, and misogyny is perfectly okay and above reproach apparently, as are the deaths of 130,000 people.
Corbyn was a disaster on the doorstep. Everyone knew that he couldn't lead the working class out of a paper bag. Now John's developed this momentum group, this party within a party, aiming to keep the purity. The culture of betrayal goes on. You'll hear it now more and more over the next couple of days as this little cult get their act together. I want them out of the party. I want momentum gone. Go back to your student politics and your little, left-wing...
But that isn't realistically going to happen, is it?
Well, I'm just
I
saying,
don't know.
I'm saying what I want.
Yeah.
Saying what I want after, if that exit poll's wrong, the most disastrous result for the Labour Party. The worst result since 1935.
I think Alan's anger is clearly anger that he's always had about me and people like me. But actually, momentum has captured the energy and enthusiasm of the hundreds of thousands of people who've joined the Labour Party in support of precisely these policies.
Momentum has had some successes, a lot of them in fact. The problem is that their successes have mostly been with the younger generations, as it turns out that the older generations, the boomers and so on, are less susceptible to being convinced by social media, and in many ways their activism has actually alienated a lot of older people towards the movement. Also, this guy here is Alistair Campbell, a prominent cabinet member, and a Tony Blair, and let's be honest here, if he's a Blairite, no fucking shit he's not gonna like Corbyn. You may as well ask a fucking Tory.
And what have you made of the actual campaign itself?
I don't think Boris Johnson won it. I think Corbyn lost it. Yeah. I think it was not a well thought campaign, and they sort of, it feels to me like they concentrated on there's a liberal elite of which we are all members, which it really appealed to. And then there's working class people that it didn't. It felt very similar to the Hillary thing in the States, where they lost they're losing these northern seats. It really the majority's coming down. It really feels like they're losing the heartlands with that message.
A message of hope is not appealing to older working class people because, as we've seen again and again, it's the youth who are really pushing this message of hope and voting for left-wing parties, just like it was the older generations voting for Brexit and the younger ones voting Remain. What's the solution, Veedu? Also, surprise surprise, the tax-dodging mega-rich comedian Jimmy Carr is happy to have a go at Corbyn, the man who would have forced him to pay his fucking taxes for once, which fund hospitals and keep public services running. I don't think I could even pretend to be shocked about that. The comparison to the 2016 US election is telling, though not for the reasons Carr thinks. See, this election showed the rise of a far-right bigot, a proto-fascist demagogue, and elitist rich bellend with a past of questionable treatment of minority groups and inherited wealth who failed upwards. There is a fascist wave breaking across the West, and I think it's terrifying. The worst part is, in this case, the similarities were staring everyone in the face. Everyone who knew anything about Johnson knew that he was functionally just a British version of Donald Trump, and yet they still voted for him.
As we've seen, there is this thing called the liberal elite. There's a group of people who, they're educated, they're metropolitan, they're middle class, they live a good quality life. There's nothing wrong with those things, by the way. But at the same time, they claim to speak for the working class people, right? They claim to speak for these people, and you hear this all the time. What about the poor? Don't you care about the poor? We need to help the poor and listen to them and da-da-da-da-da. Fine, these are all very great things. But When the poor people speak, when the working class speak, when they express their opinions and concerns, you call them racists, xenophobes, bigots, and deplorables.
Well, I mean, the left speak for the interests of the working people and those in poverty, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll automatically get their votes. Poor people voting against their own interests is an extremely well-documented phenomenon going back decades, mostly due to the media and misleading rhetoric or even lies. Trump promised universal healthcare, remember? So yes, if a working class person starts going on about how the immigrants are to blame, not the rich or the bosses or whatever, then they're provably wrong, and if they then go on to say a bunch more bigoted shit, then yes, sorry, they're also a bigot. Maybe they're misinformed, and maybe they can be brought round, but maybe not. We should certainly try, but that doesn't mean that there's any kind of guarantee. I'm a socialist, and I proudly stand with my fellow workers, but if they start being bigoted, I'll tell them that they're being a dickhead. The two aren't mutually exclusive. We shouldn't have to accept bigotry in order to fight for workers' rights, and if that's the only way we can do it, well, some might ask, is it even worth it? Where do marginalised people have left to turn if even the left abandons them in favour of begging for the votes of racists?
Even in America, we hear this so many times when working class people who voted for Obama twice, then vote for Trump, these people are now deplorables. We could drain the swamp.
The drain the swamp thing was Trump, not Hillary, but again, part of intersectionality, and one of my favourite parts of left-wing philosophy, is to reject bigotry and fascism in all its forms. Sure, demonising them is shitty and maybe unfair, and I tend to prefer to attack the bigotry, not the bigots, but, well, some people can't be convinced away from bigotry. It's sad, but true, and some of those people who voted for Obama twice, but in 2016 marched through a park waving tiki torches and chanting Nazi shit, they're pretty fucking deplorable. And okay, yeah, not all Trump or Johnson supporters are super far right, but they were aware of their crimes and their history of horrendous behaviour, or at least they should have been if they were the sort of person to even bother researching candidates before voting. So voting for them does necessarily imply either support for or ambivalence about hateful rhetoric, or even outright bigotry. Look, I believe that anyone can change their mind, but the information was out there, so it implies that either they were aware of the horrendous nature of a Boris Johnson government, but either supported it or didn't care enough about vulnerable people not to vote for one, or didn't bother to research it and were willfully ignorant, neither of which are favourable positions to take. Honestly, the media was so aggressive in its anti-Corbyn campaign that I genuinely don't know what could have counteracted it.
When in the UK, when large swathes of Labour supporters, Labour towns vote for Brexit, they're racist, they're uneducated, they don't know what they're doing, they have no, you've stripped them of their agency, right? They didn't know what they were getting themselves into. Right? You hear this all the time.
Okay, so this is a problem. No, not everyone who voted for Brexit is a racist, but I hasten to point out that basically every racist voted for Brexit. There's a reason the furthest right party in the UK right now is called the Brexit Party. This is a whole can of worms I don't want to go into the nuances of right now, but when you have Brexit supporters doing and saying shit like this, forgive me if I start to make a few connections.
When they vote for Boris Johnson, oh, they're stupid, they're racist, all this kind of stuff.
They're not stupid or racist necessarily, but they voted against their own interests and for the world's most bigoted man, so again, there are correlations beginning to emerge here. Not necessarily causations, but it's starting to look a bit suspicious.
So you, on one hand, you claim to speak for them. You claim to have their best interests at heart, but when they speak and express themselves, you hit them over the head with these insults and slurs, which we know in America and UK. If you call someone a racist, it's a very, very big thing, right? You could ruin their career and make life very hard for them. Yet they use these words like it's no problem.
I mean, maybe this is a thing. I personally haven't seen it, but I will happily call someone a racist if they're being a racist.
On top of that, you guys speak about issues that are so fringe that only privileged people have the time and energy to care about them, whether it's gender pronouns, microaggressions, focusing very heavily on transgender issues when the overwhelming majority of people are not transgender.
Trans people make up around 1% of the population. That's 700,000 UK voters, but even forgetting that, this is basically civil rights stuff. This was a tiny, tiny bit of the Labour manifesto, but the media blew it way out of proportion. Would you say, honestly, this is an election, why the fuck would you give a shit about gay marriage? Most people aren't even gay! Or something 10 years ago. That's what this is, another civil rights battle for the left to support, as we do with most civil rights, and the right to oppose due to a combination of bigotry and not believing that it affects enough people to be worth talking about, so those 700,000 people can them go fuck themselves. What was all that about talking down to and invalidating the opinions of working class voters, Veedu? Because I hate to break it to you, but a lot of trans people, trans allies and trans activists are working class. Why do you think that people in minority groups don't deserve to have their rights fought for? Did you even read the manifestos? The majority of the Labour manifesto wasn't about trans issues, you know. It was like one tiny section of one page, and there were a lot of pages. I made a feature-length breakdown of them if you didn't, although the environment section of the Tories manifesto does have fucked up audio. Feel free to skip that bit. It's okay to admit that you're an ignorant right-winger who just believes what he's told by the Murdoch papers rather than doing his own research, but if that's what you are, don't pretend that you have a clue what you're fucking talking about, and certainly don't presume to lecture people who actually do.
Right, and even transgender people just have to get on with their lives. They don't have the time and privilege to constantly talk about these things in great detail, so on and so forth.
What the fuck do you mean? How can you complain about trans activism in one breath and then in the next act like trans people don't have the time to fight for their civil rights? If they don't have the time, how is trans activism still getting done? Women didn't have the time to fight for their rights because they were looking after their household and children all day, and yet the suffragette movement took off. Are you implying that trans activists are mostly cis? Because that's certainly not been my experience, but hey, I guess you know what? If you're not trans, shut the fuck up about trans issues. Let them suffer alone. Allyship is worthless now, apparently.
You call this country a racist white patriarchy? How do you think you're going to appeal to white working class areas in the north?
There is a fucking ton of racism in the UK, a lot of it inspired by our current Prime Minister. Our society fits neatly within the academic, not dictionary, don't get smart. When progressives say patriarchy, they do not mean this, they mean this definition of a patriarchy. And let's just talk about the flag. Throughout history, innumerable atrocities have been carried out under that flag, and the fact that we still fly it could be argued is a racist act. After all, as I pointed out in a previous video, other civilizations that committed atrocities have changed their flag since then. We've not. But the point here is clearly just that the far right do use the flag as a symbol of white supremacy, and to be honest, in the UK this is mostly true. I've never met anyone who flies the England flag, excluding during sporting events, who wasn't at least a little racist or been harassed by a gammon on Twitter who didn't have multiple England flags in their display name. And it's these groups that often go on about their blind patriotism because those of us of a little less racist persuasion might stop to think, if I'm proud of this flag and all the things that happened under it, well, what does that say about me? I made a whole video about this, so I'll just leave it there for now rather than just repeat myself.
Alright, I do have some anxieties about the England flag, okay, which I know is complicated, but I kind of think if people wanted me to love the England flag, they shouldn't have spent the entire 1970s running around waving it whilst putting dog excrement through Pakistanis' letterboxes. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not, right, but if you grew up in a big city in England in the 70s, one of your points of contact with the England flag was with the far right and the National Front and things like that. It was a far right symbol. In the 1970s, if you were flying an England flag off your house, it meant you were either an admirer of Adolf Hitler or a member of the royal family. Look, I know it's different now, right, and the England flag's never used to intimidate anyone today, but it isn't. It's like a smiley face. But sometimes you're stuck with what a symbol means to you, aren't you? It's a bit like these old hippies that say, the swastika, Stu, far from being a symbol of Nazism, is in fact a Hindu good luck charm. And I always think, well, good luck with that. That may be the case, but you're going to need a lot of Hindu good luck if you're considering wandering around Golders Green waving.
They get up in the morning, they work very hard for a living, and then you have the audacity to turn around with your university education, with mummy and daddy paying for all your stuff, and then you turn around and say to you guys are privileged and racist and patriarchy, and check your privilege. Yeah, that's going to go down really well in the heartlands of this country. Nice one, guys. Really good strategy.
Basic misunderstanding of how privilege works. Yes, rich people, even rich liberals, are privileged, that's true, but wealth isn't the only kind of privilege, and when people go on about white privilege or whatever, they don't mean white people all have amazing lives and never struggle. They mean non-white people have to deal with situations and struggles that white people never do. Like the police brutality.
It's almost like Gillette basically turning on their major consumer and saying to men, you guys suck, please buy our product.
Oh, fuck off. Gillette literally just said, hey men, don't be dicks, creep on women or let your kids beat the shit out of each other, and it sent all the right-wingers into a frenzy of frothing rage. And the best part, it was designed as a piece of deliberate outrage marketing, and due to the backlash, the name Gillette was being talked about so much that, hey, would you look at that, sales went up by quite a large margin, and all complaining about it does is help them sell more razors. And if you really think that all men are as toxic as portrayed in the ad, well, you should probably look into getting therapy, mate, because toxic masculinity is not healthy.
Yeah. not a good strategy.
According to Reuters, Gillette sales have been declining for years due to not remaining as competitive as other newer brands, and the US men's shaving product market reducing by 11%. So unless that one ad can ripple back in time and cause underperformance for years in the past, I'm going to say that, much like 42 before him, this isn't quite the gotcha Veedu thinks it is.
These liberal elite, these champagne socialists, these wokistanis need to get a grip. They need a reality check if they want to win an election. If they want to speak the language of the people, if they want to actually win something, instead of getting their asses handed to them constantly, they need to immerse themselves with real people and leave the bubble, leave the liberal bubble.
I am a socialist. Almost all of my friends and family are working class. I still believe that calling a bigot is good, even if that person is working class, and I don't think that we should capitulate to bigots in order to get their votes. I've spoken with and ultimately failed to convince a lot of fellow working class people, but I've also managed to have productive conversations too. How does he explain people like me? Does he think we don't exist? Seems to me that Veedu is quite well off himself and is telling working class people like me what to think and do, so maybe he should just take his own advice. Just a thought.
If you look at the map, the overwhelming majority of this country voted Conservative. The one place that overwhelmingly did not vote Conservative was London.
That's hilarious. Okay, so look at this map of the UK and tell me which part of this image jumped out at you. Was it this tiny little cluster of red here, or was it literally all of Scotland, which voted almost unanimously for the centre-left Scottish National Party? Regardless of whatever bullshit he's about to make, how do you look at this image and think, oh yes, London, we need to work out what went right there rather than Scotland? Or this little chunk of Liverpool, the only city in the UK that boycotts the far right-wing press. I wonder why they might not have voted Tory.
So you have, again, London, if you were to compare it to the rest of the country, are economically much better universities, better everything, jobs, everything. So these people are in their own bubble, and I live in London, I know.
This means nothing though. The average person in London doesn't have a better quality of life, you know. Everything is more expensive, housing is ridiculously pricey for what you get, and poverty is rife. There's a reason London has a higher minimum wage than the rest of the country, and that's because of the cost of living there. London has money because that's where all the banks are, but that money isn't being distributed fairly. It's being hoarded by the rich in the same way that the UK has the 5th largest economy in the world, but the average British person doesn't have the 5th highest quality of life in the world, because whilst that wealth may exist, there's no guarantee that it's being filtered down to the average voter. Does he not understand how the economy works? He positions himself as pretty conservative, so I would have thought that he'd be a big fan of capitalism, but apparently he just has no clue how it works. Sadly, we do not live in an anarcho-communist society in which all wealth is evenly distributed, Veedu. In fact, most of it is funneled upwards to a small cluster of extremely rich bosses. So this argument is nonsensical at best.
If you were to say I'm a young guy, especially brown guy, and I have conservative tendencies, although I didn't vote in the election, but if you were to say that, you'd be like, this guy, diversity, multiculturalism, you an immigrant, don't you understand? But the issue is far more complex than that, and people don't want to recognize the complexities in the issue. They want to make it very clear, black and white. You're either with us or against us, and if you're against us, there must be something wrong with you. You must be a racist or bigot. The opposite side, they have no valid reason for what they believe in.
Yeah, sorry, you can pretend that it's more complex and nuanced than it actually is, and you, the special snowflake centre-right voter, are the only one who really understands the true extent of all the issues, even though you apparently didn't bother to read the manifestos. But the way I see it, it was a choice between more or less dead vulnerable people and starving kids. I voted for less. How about you? Oh, you didn't vote? Well, that implies either wanting more dead people or ambivalence over whether or not you do want more dead people, which either way is pretty fucked up.
So please humanize the very people that you're trying to win over. Maybe listen to them. That might help you win elections.
Okay, but it's an uphill battle when the press is doing everything possible to fight against us, the ruling party breaks election rules in order to play dirty tricks, and an overwhelming majority of people are unable or unwilling to actually research the issues, apparently. I'm not saying they're all bigots, I'm just saying some of them are, and maybe if Rupert Murdoch wasn't so shit scared of paying taxes, we might have had more of a chance. I know what he's saying here, by the way. He's basically just saying stop being so left-wing, move towards the centre and you'll get more support, accept and ignore bigotry and you might win, but that's not a win for the left, is it? It's a win for a bigoted centrist party that might still be called the Labour Party, and we already have one of those. They're called the Lib Dems, and they're absolute cunts. Don't get me wrong, I agree that maybe some bigots can be argued out of their prejudices, but I'm not sure how effective that strategy is on a wide scale. How do you convince millions of bigots that they should care about other people? How do you encourage empathy in a population? Veedu apparently thinks the solution is unquestioningly accepting them into our ranks without any pushback, but I would disagree. A major talking point this election was the alleged anti-Semitism in Labour. How much worse could it have been if if Corbyn had turned around and said, look, you snowflakes don't understand working people. They all hate the Jews. Have some faith in the working class, Veedu. Bigotry is not an intrinsic part of working class Britain, and we shouldn't treat it as such. We should oppose and challenge it at every possible opportunity, and we should never deem it acceptable, especially in a party ostensibly standing for the rights of the vulnerable.
Just saying, if you don't want to win elections and keep this project of wokeism, or I don't know what you want to call it, this wokist, people are worried this country's going to become like a Londonistan. There's too many brown people. Forget that. The real issue is this is going to become a wokistan. Right, and we dodged a bullet here, guys. We dodged a bullet.
Yeah, it's the lefties that are the problem, guys. I mean, it's not like the right wing are the main ones organising terror attacks, committing hate crimes, deporting black British citizens, graffitiing swastikas on everything, participating in harassment campaigns, making people uncomfortable existing in their home country because of their status as a marginalised person, or literally murdering an MP while shouting the name of a far-right pressure group, the leader of which has now encouraged its members to vote Tory because Johnson is their guy. Yeah, they show a picture of Ash Sakar and imply that the woke left are taking over. This woman is more of a problem than Tommy Robinson, I guess. Just fucking holy shit.
Yeah. Check it.
I've said it before, and I'm sure I'll say it another few hundred times. I really should get around to making the video about it. But centrism is the most dangerous, terrible ideology on the face of the planet. Oh, don't get me wrong, the right are far more obviously malicious and terrifying, but they're usually less powerful and numerous than due to their tendency to lean further right than left. After all, fascism will preserve much more of the status quo than communism, and the centrist position on politics tends to boil down to an obsessive worship of the status quo, regardless of other moral considerations. It's the centrists that ultimately give the fascists power. Furthermore, if you're going to be a patronising prick and lord it over other people who lost an election in which you didn't bother to vote yourself, at least try to educate yourself or read the fucking manifestos before acting like you're an expert on the internet. Also, if your primary concern after an election in which the party who killed hundreds of thousands of vulnerable people won is to claim that politeness is more important than justice whilst citing extreme far-right publication, well, maybe you should reassess the validity of your actions and ideology.
Is it water with the sheep in the box?
That's probably going to be my last direct response video, excluding the PragerU ones, because I do quite like making them and they're not really the same thing, for quite a while. And hopefully it'll be the last time I talk about the 2019 election until I do get around to making my British fascism video. Anyway, I hope you're all having a great new year, and I am probably taking another break after this, just because I probably can't keep up the one a week schedule that I've been doing for the past few months. But we'll see. I might be able to. I don't know how. We'll see how it goes anyway. But of course, you know why we're here by now. The people you're currently seeing on screen are the people who give me money each month, which again is fantastic, and thank you so much to those people. I cannot thank you enough. But I especially want to thank Corvus. Next we have Brian, Stacey Solano, Susie M, Thomas McCallum, and Tom Newport.
Fucking Tory cunt.